welcome. My name is Belinda Ganaway. I'm supporting the team on the Enterprising Impact Conversation Series. So welcome to the second in the conversation series. We're going to be talking about commercial routes to social benefit, impact without compromise. We've got four amazing speakers with us today. Before we kick off, just a tiny bit of housekeeping about how we're running the session, the rest of the series, and when you can find more information. Hopefully you can see my screen okay. Charlotte, give us a thumbs up. Excellent, thank you so much. So as I say, this is the second in the Enterprising Impact Conversation series. So what's the series all about? Basically, no surprises, it's for social science researchers and also professional services teams across a number of universities. And across these 5 conversations and 3 associated deep dive workshops that you can also sign up for, we're going to be exploring what new ways to help you create greater social value from your research, to build your career. And also we want to make them really, really practical. As I said, they are a conversation. We really want dialogue, but we want to make sure that you individually take away really practical steps and things that you might be like to do next as a result of these conversations. And also be connecting you to specialist advisors who can help with that. You can see the full conversation series, i.e. the remaining 3 conversations after this, plus those 3 deep dive workshops, all on Eventbrite, and there is a bit.ly link here on the slide, which we'll also put into the chat repeatedly as well. So if you haven't seen that link yet, it will keep going into the chat. So you can click on that link and sign up for the rest of the series. So today's speakers, as I say, 4 speakers today. So we're going to kick off with Professor Rob Klassen, who is Professor and Chair of the Psychology in Education Research Centre at the University of York. Followed by Professor Andy Sterling from right here in Brighton, so Professor of Science and Technology Policy at the University of Sussex Business School. And bringing up the rear of the talking slots, we've got Paul and Sally from Evidence to Impact. In each of these 3 presentation slots, the speakers will be exploring a number of questions with you and really drawing on their own experiences and their own case studies and their own insights of how they've, what they've seen along the road to this in this area. So, do commercial routes necessarily compromise the principles underpinning research? Can you take a business approach, and does this allow for the development of sustainable impact and greater reach? And therefore, does this actually bring about greater positive change? And what else is important for researchers to know? So these are the questions that we've asked your speakers today to draw on. At the end of the 3 presentations, we will be having a panel discussion. So we'd love to hear your comments and thoughts throughout the time that we're together. So do jump onto the chat now, get confident with it, say hello, tell us what you're interested in and where you're from today. And also do put in your comments, thoughts and questions as we go along, and we'll make sure that we address those as we go along, but also we definitely pick those up in the panel session. So I'm going to kick off with our first speaker, Professor Bob Klassen. Bob's going to be talking about the pros and cons of commercializing social sciences research and drawing on some of his own expertise and insights from his experience in this area. So Bob, over to you.
Great, thanks very much, Belinda. I'm going to be talking about the venture that we've started at the University of York. And it's about teacher selection and teacher recruitment. So we call it a hybrid research commercial venture because it's a challenge to commercialize in social sciences. And so we're called TSP, and our project is designed to improve the teacher workforce. And I'm going to discuss our project and its funding, our move from research to commercialization, and the challenges, the pros and cons of commercialization. And so the goal of our venture is to improve educational outcomes by strengthening the teacher workforce in the UK and globally. And we look at recruitment and development of teachers in the UK and around the world. And I'm going to start by just talking about our research base, because that's something everybody I think has in common when we're coming from a university background. So the typical sequence of building a teacher workforce and the research that we've done focuses on recruitment, on selection, and on development. And most of our work has been in the area of selection, and we've developed and tested various tools. And we, in fact, had a book that we published in the last while, and we've done lots of research and writing on this topic. And that's of interest to me and my group, but probably not very much of interest to people in this conversation today. But I just wanted to show that this is what we're working on, and this is our research base. And so we come from a foundation of research funding, and that's how we funded our work over, well, the last 10 years. I'm from Canada and had funding from the US and Canada when before coming here. And then in the UK, our funding has come from the ERC. And then recently from the ESRC IAA funds administered by our university, which has been very helpful in looking at some of our applied work. The ARC Accelerated program, we were able to access some funding from that program where we learned about commercialization. And now we've been looking at getting money from contracts from some of the partners and clients that we're working with. And so you can just see the evolution from, pure research funding to more applied funding, and in fact, some actual contracts and consultancy contracts and so forth. So the background of our project is that there's a need for teacher recruitment methods are generally poor. We found that most of the tools and methods that are used are inefficient and ineffective. And so we developed a lot of our work based on teacher motivation models and developed some new methods using various technologies that address that problem. And so just as an example, we have something for recruitment called T-Attract. And this research that we based this on was attracting applicants to consider teaching as a career. We're working on that right now. And this intervention delivers fit messages to potential applicants for teacher training. And so that's one of the tools that we developed out of our research. The second thing is T-Screen, which is a selection tool, situational judgment test. And that's another technology-based tool that can be delivered at scale. And we've worked and tested on that and on probably over 100,000 applicants and trainees over the last few years. And then finally, we have some development tools that we've developed using kind of similar methodologies. And these use a scenario-based learning methodology that develops future teachers during training, and it places them virtually into classroom settings, and they get real-time feedback from expert teachers. Okay, so that's the kind of the tools that we've developed. Those are the things that we had been working on in our research projects to test and to look at their foundations and their efficacy and so forth. But we faced this this problem, this obstacle after we finished this stage of the research. We thought we really want to apply this research-based, these tools into a lot of different settings. And UKRI, of course, says that to say social science shouldn't be commercialized is limiting its potential and restricting its use, especially if it's been publicly funded. And so for many researchers, and we're going to talk, I think, more about impact with Andy in just a few minutes, but for many researchers, the overarching goal is to make an impact. And setting up a social enterprise or partnering with a company to exploit research is one way to achieve sustainable impact. And that's kind of the stage that we're at. So commercializing the research-based tools that we've developed is one way to continue to sustain what we've been working with. Really importantly, it's a way to sustain a team, and it's something that we've been able to do. We fought tooth and nail to try to keep our team together, and that's something I think those who have research teams face as an obstacle all of the time. And research funds, that's one way to sustain your team, but another way is to exploit, to use the tools that you've developed and to be able to generate funding to keep your team working together to expand what you've done. When I did the ARC Accelerator program, we put together this route to market and milestones, and it was like very linear. It's like, okay, in year one, this is what we're going to do. In year two, this is what we're going to do. And then in year three, it'll be amazing. We'll take over America and launch new products, and it'll be amazing. And of course, it really doesn't work like that. And of course, you know what it's going to look like. It's just been so much different than we expected, and it's not very linear, and there's a lot of ups and downs and a lot of challenges. Just want to talk about the actual challenges that we face and the pros and cons. So I've talked to you about what we do and what kind of our background and our tools and our research and how we've kind of funded the work that we've done for the last 10 years. But there's real pros and cons. And maybe a pro might be that there's a lot to learn. And it really, if you want to seriously consider commercialization, it's not just like Dragon's Den. It's a bit like that, but there's just so much to learn about the nuts and bolts of trying to put together a commercial venture. It's really hard. And most academics, or at least this one, is, you know, we're absolute beginners at trying to figure out how to commercialize something. We have university support. We have a commercialization team that has been very helpful. And but in the end, it's really something that you need to be quite wholeheartedly engaged in and enthusiastic about and energetic about, because it's really hard to do, even with the support that our university has done really well. Another pro is that you can build or retain your team. And so that's probably our strongest one of, no, that's not true, but it's been a really strong incentive, is we try to keep our group together. We have some excellent researchers, technicians, education consultants, and so forth, and we work together well, and we're doing work that's been making a difference in certain ways. And it's something that it's a way of being able to kind of sustain a program of research and development. A downside is it's really stressful and it's really time consuming, and it can make it quite difficult to fit everything in, because if you're pursuing this kind of path in a university setting, it's likely that you'll still be doing all the other things that you do in a university setting. And so it can take a fair bit of time away from other activities. It's exciting because you're a bit of a pioneer, but and my head of department's always like, "Oh, Rob, you're a pioneer, and that's really great." And it's like, okay, thank you, but it's really hard to do that, and it means that, and the biggest challenge is always like financial systems, and like, how does the money get paid into this? And it just takes endless hours to make it work smoothly in a university setting. And so, and our department has tried very hard, and it's been supportive, but it's quite challenging to kind of do things in a different way in a system that doesn't readily do things in a different way. Sorry, like everyone else, I'm coughing a bit with a bit of fever and so forth. It's not either or. It's something that as an academic, you don't have to, I don't know, sell out completely to the commercialization world. And it makes a lot of sense to continue with a real focus on research. And so it's something that in our group, we were pursuing research grants, and as well as selling the tools that we've developed. And at least at this stage, it's something that is not either or. It's not commercialization or research. It's something that we consider it a hybrid model, where we can do research as well as look at commercialization. It's definitely not for everyone. And I'm sure that in most universities, the vast majority of social scientists won't be involved in commercialization. But it makes a lot of sense for people whose work fits into a category that makes sense for commercialization, where it makes sense to disseminate that research and the products and the applications of that research outside of just research circles. It's kind of a pleasing research progression from very basic research to more applied, and then to completely applied in commercialization settings. It makes sense to follow that sequence for some people. And in the case of the work that I was doing, that made sense to pursue commercial applications of it. And maybe this is a pro, but universities and social sciences departments like the notion of it, and whether that chimes with your values and interests or not is another issue, but it's something that certainly supports and strengthens contributions to things like REF, for example. But on the downside, even though universities and social sciences departments like commercialization, they're not really set up for the most part to support it. I think that's changing, and I can see our university changing and growing in that regard. Whether that's a good thing or not, I think we'll probably talk about today. But that is something that we've received good support. And I think that most universities in the UK are considering this as an element of working with researchers for some researchers to consider commercialization. So I think that's quite positive. And then I guess an advantage is you get to work with lots of partners. And so through our commercialization activities, we've had the chance to work with a lot of different groups, university groups and government ministries and NGOs and charities. And if we want to continue to develop these applied research products that we've developed, then I think it's important that we need to generate funding for it. Whether that's from research, that's a possibility, but it's very difficult to have sustained research funding for projects like this. And commercialization for us has kind of given us a viable pathway to continue to pursue our work. And so that's what I've done. And if you want to find out more about our, sorry, if you want to find out more about our team and our work, you can go to our website. Thank you very much.
Rob, thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us when I know you're struggling with ill health. And I can't believe you managed to stave off the coughs until right at the end. So that was perfect timing. Thank you very much. I'm really excited to introduce next speaker. So Professor Andy Sterling, as I said, Professor of Science and Technology Policy at the University of Sussex Business School. When we were having some dialogue around this session and exploring it, we had some really fascinating and robust conversations about this whole area. And as Rob said, I know Andy's got some interesting and new perspectives on things like even what do we mean by this phrase impact. So I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to hand over to Andy. Andy, over to you.
Thanks, Belinda. I don't know if that's interesting as in the apocryphal Chinese curse, but I'll do my best. And thanks to you and Lorna and other folk behind this for inviting me, and also for framing this discussion in the open way you have. And also thanks to Rob. That was a great talk, and both in respect of the general issues you raised, Rob, and in respect of the practical experience, which I'll come to later. I really endorse what you said. I think it was really great kickoff. I'm going to take a couple of steps back, as Belinda suggested. And by the way, I'm a dangerous man if you give me a PowerPoint, so I'm just going to shunter along for 10 minutes and just cut me off at the end. But I think I'll just take my time much better that way. So I'm going to take a couple of steps back to just think about some of the issues behind what we're talking about today, because they really pop up and bite you if you don't think about them. And one of those Rob just alluded to with UKRI kind of materials on commercial impact, because it's really, we should acknowledge whatever side of these debates we come from, that it's really not surprising that there's a skeptical backlash against ideas of commercial impact. When we talk about the compromises, for instance, in the title of this session, it pays to really think about what are the terms of compromise that go on. Because we have to admit, I think, that a lot of the talk of commercial impact is pretty tokenistic. There's many ways in which profit for social benefit can actually be a fig leaf for more private interests. And what's going on is that academia, the work we do, the research we do, especially in social related work, gets oriented more towards convenient agendas. So it's not just about sustaining a team, it's about what that team does. Does it do different things than it otherwise might do? And of course, there is a chance it will, but there's also a chance of other really wonderful things happening as well. And again, the idea of impact that goes into this field is worth reminding. I think it's quite eccentrically individualized and mechanical. We all know as academics and university professionals what the world of knowledge production is like. It's like sausage making. You don't get up too close to it, really. It's very messy, very distributed, very complex. It's about as meaningful to ask about the impact of an individual water molecule on the flow of water in a stream as it is to ask about the individual impact of researchers in changing entire societies. Academia is as much about appropriating knowledge, often from businesses, NGOs, wider society, and then codifying it and claiming it, as it is about creating it in the first place. And that's why we see, as we're all familiar with, I'm sure, these tussles about logos and about IP. Those are often more important drivers than the content sometimes in how you pitch things. So we all know that, I think. So we need care then that this doesn't become a kind of political correctness all of its own, of a kind that universities fall into in various political directions. And that what you're doing with this impact is not what powerful interests would want you to do anyway. Because again, it's worth thinking about something that very rarely gets talked about in my experience, that it's much easier, whether it be in markets, commercially, or in policy terms, or indeed in civil society, it's much easier to document impacts which go along with the grain of what powerful interests want to do anyway, than it is when you're going against that grain. And of course, then commercialization adds kerosene to that. You can get endorsements, you can get citations, you can get letters of commendation much more easily if you've done something that somebody wanted to do anyway, and they may even have given pretty strong signals about what that thing was. And I've seen that pretty up close, not only in my own work at the Science Policy Research Unit, where we work on some of these high takes issues in science and technology, but also on the Research Excellence Framework on one of the panels there, where you see research impact discussed in ways that really show this very strongly. But it's almost like sex to Victorians. We don't talk about it. So simplistic impact talk can become a code for the disciplining effect of power on academia. That doesn't mean it's necessarily bad. It just means it's more likely to become so if we don't talk about it, because there's nothing in this world that's perfect. So that's the kind of starting point I'd like to say, but also it's worth remembering that left to their own devices, many academics like to pretend to be objective. Academia on its own isn't some pristine state. Often it's completely full of values and normative commitments, often just to a particular method or a particular discipline. Social science is especially bad at that. So it's not as if without this academia is somehow pure. It's not pure at all. So the point about this then is making the values that drive research more accountable. And I think ideas of impact can be a really good way of doing that. We become accountable, not just for our methods, but for what it is we're trying to do in the world, rather than pretending that we're just in our ivory tower. So that's a positive side of the whole commercialization, which may not be one that we necessarily put center stage. So again, the devil is in the detail here in ways that other people in this meeting understand much better than I in the commercialization of research. Is it through charities, social enterprises, cooperatives, benefit corporations? These differences really matter. It's not before you get to shareholder companies or private profit making firms. These really matter, and I think those devils in details are often worth really unpicking rather than just talking about commercialization. And in the end, of course, a crucial factor is going to be your personal political values. They do matter, as Rob alluded to. But whatever those values, and my own work tends to be much more critical, it's not necessarily negative to try to be commercialized. And I've tried to do that with an example I want to talk about, which actually began ironically. The example is multi-criteria mapping. It's a decision tool that, thanks to the Sussex Enterprise panel about 10 years ago, was commercialized from an earlier form. And it's been a really, really interesting experience putting that out. And it began, it's worth mentioning, in the context of my somewhat, momentous sort of introduction, with work with powerful organizations who I was criticizing in the nuclear industry, in the GM industry, in particular Unilever, where from the process of criticizing the way that these big global corporations were pushing their own technologies and how they use different techniques to justify that, Unilever came forward and said, all right, then, how should we do it? And it was a really, really interesting experience working with them, getting really very surprisingly unconditional funds to develop a technique further that I'd already done it on a spreadsheet to actually show how this could be done, called multi-criteria mapping. And what it does is it just very simply, instead of cranking out one definitive answer like a lot of these tools do, it explores the way different assumptions, different values would actually give different answers about which technologies are better or worse, including the technologies being promoted energetically by companies like Unilever or Scottish Nuclear, who I also work with on this. So it was wonderful to get that support originally. I was really educated by how open that business environment was to supporting something even against their own interests. And then later, working with the Sussex Enterprise Panel, it was a very useful disciplining process about how to actually think about putting it about more widely. But all this said, and it's now used, MCM, as a tool in academia and business and NGOs and governments quite widely around the world. But it's worth saying it's MCM, multi-criteria mapping, is very much a not-for-profit enterprise. And we could talk about this in a bit more detail, but it's aimed to recover investments, to cover investments in the further development of the tool, which was also done by research projects. And if we were to go for a for-profit model rather than a social or university enterprise, I think the tool would start being under real pressure to do a different job. So that's the point I tried to make at the beginning about the orientation of the work being as important as whether you keep it going or not. So in the end then, my own experience is highly limited. I don't claim very much for all this, it's just a snapshot. And it does show, though, that it's perfectly possible to be critical about how power works in the economy and policy, and yet at the same time work effectively with commercial firms, sometimes rather large and dominant ones, towards more progressive outcomes. And even deliberately critical efforts like multi-criteria mapping can be undertaken in that way, but you have to be careful. You have to be open-eyed, I think, about impact talk. Don't just trot it out, question it in ways that Rob did at the beginning and I'm trying to do now. Recognize that not all impact has to be commercial, that not all commercial activity has to be for profit. And if we think openly and carefully about power relations, then actually we can square all these circles and do do things that even with commercial routes make the world a better place, even in the most radical of critical perspectives. And at the same time, if you're lucky, you might even have a bit of fun, which is certainly from time to time what I've managed to have, including now. So thanks a lot.
Thank you, Andy. That was absolutely great. And I know it's going to generate lots of questions and thoughts. So do add your thoughts to the chat. And as I say, lots of questions to Andy in the panel session. Andy, just a quick note to you. Your talk is fantastic and we love it, and there's lots of energy in it, and it's creating a bit of wobble on your desk. I don't know if there's anything you could do. Doesn't matter if not, we love the passion behind it, but yeah, just a note if anybody else is feeling a tiny bit seasick. But thank you very much, and we will come back to you. So I'm going to hand over to Paul Harrod, who's the CEO, and Sally Good, who's the Director of Services at Evidence to Impact. So we've asked them to address a number of questions today. And also, tricky question, because they're doing it on the hoof, just reflect on what they've heard so far as well. But before you guys do that, would you mind giving us a brief, I'm sure lots of people do know what evidence to impact is, but it'd be useful for those that don't, just to give a wee introduction to what evidence to impact is and what you do.
Thank you, Belinda. Good afternoon. Yeah, we're actually a social enterprise, but we're a not-for-profit spin-out from Bristol and Cardiff universities, actually set up to try and generate impact from a really wonderful piece of research done back in those two universities over 10 years ago. So I'll talk a bit about that and hopefully how that's relevant to today's topic. We work actually now with universities across the country. I suppose really where you have academics who, unlike Rob, who's wonderful, don't necessarily have the time or the inclination or the skills to take their research forward, but still want to see it creating impact. So often then you do need a partnership approach where perhaps social enterprises can come in either to directly license some research or help to co-create it with the academics. But perhaps just a quick case study, because it may sort of bring this to life a bit. There was work done at Bristol and Cardiff universities, a very large randomized control trial to reduce the smoking uptake in teenagers. So teenagers hopefully had never smoked before, to try and get to the point where they wouldn't take it up. Obviously, then there would be very, very significant long-term health benefits for them for the rest of their lives. And this was really successful research. They demonstrated a very clear, statistically significant reduction in smoking uptakes. And the question was, at the end of that point of the research had been well funded, it had been published in the Lancet, and was clearly very impactful. What was then the best way to roll this out? I think we found at the time, and I think it's been the case with universities we work with across the country since, that there's often a very tangible gap between the end points of the research, the end of that funding, and the point at which it can be sustainably rolled out to the communities that need it the most. Now, of course, then the first question is, well, why not simply make it freely available? And in some cases, that could well be the correct and most appropriate approach. But in this case, the work has been delivered in schools, and the schools have been funded actually to be part of the original research. And of course, they weren't going to pay. It wouldn't be appropriate for them. Actually, local authorities who had a responsibility to reduce smoking in their locality could pay for that. And we suggested actually a licensing model where they had the right to deliver the assist smoking prevention service across their local authority in every single school. What we called a cost recovery model, because actually there was going to be a cost to recruit new people to deliver it, to train them up, to continue to support them, to develop new materials, to turn it from what inevitably a relatively sort of rough and ready, they look like research materials, to actually more slick, technology-led, more sort of even glossy, shiny materials for delivery amongst teenagers. And then, of course, the ongoing quality assurance to make sure that actually that the protocols and methodology that was done in 2010 is still being faithfully adhered to in 2022. Now, actually, the outcome has been wonderful. People like Sally deserve far more credit than I do. But actually, in that intervening time, we think 160,000 children have benefited from this research. Actually, for the university, it's generated far more research income, because following that rollout, there was then further research income to help replicate it in France, in Colombia, and in more recently, we're hoping to get it working in China, Indonesia, and the Philippines as well. And as Rob mentioned at the start, they've had that 4-star ref case study, which of course is great for the universities. So I guess we can talk about this more in the panel discussion. I think there is a danger that universities think with some research, actually make it freely available and leave it as an off-the-shelf model to be picked up by anybody. But actually, that approach can often leave it not being off the shelf, but instead, if you'll forgive the mixed metaphor, it withers on the vine, because there's nobody there with the time and inclination to take it forward. Someone like Rob, again, is wonderful. I've said this before, but he's probably quite unusual in that generally senior academics, they want to do further research and perhaps have that full-time responsibility in their departments. So I do really think that there are increasingly third parties like Evidence to Impact that can come forward and take it forward. Because actually then the key thing is the academics, they do retain control. It's entirely appropriate they should do, but they take a more governance approach, perhaps chairing a steering group that still ensures it's their intervention. They're the ones in charge, albeit perhaps with a licensing and legal framework underneath that. But actually they can have the input they want, not necessarily operational or day-to-day involvement. Sally, do you want to pick up from that and say a few more words?
Thank you, Paul. I also love Rob's use of the word commercialisation, because we always shy away from that a bit when we talk to academics and use the cost recovery phrase to feel like we're not making money on the back of research. We're actually reinvesting it back into developing the research. So,
right, yeah.
Yeah, so Assist was a great big success story for us that founded the company. But obviously in that interim 12 years since we did that, for us, the commissioning landscape, the people who buy our interventions, that's changed massively through austerity, through the model where public health was within primary care trusts and has moved across to local authority control. So I think one of the key things when you're looking at making sustainable impact and increasing the reach of your research is I've sort of broken this down into 3 small sections, is the marketplace, is knowing your market now, but horizon planning in a way, and thinking about the trends and thinking about the way funding is going, the political landscape, what policymakers are saying. You know, for us, we've just launched a second smoking prevention program. Never in a million years did we see that coming, because smoking prevalence is falling. So the bang for buck is nowhere near as good unless you find a much cheaper, affordable way of doing an intervention, which we've done. So it's all that. So the peripheral stuff is actually a lot more important than you think. And even though it's very hard to think if this RCT is successful in 4, 5, 6 years' time, who will buy this? Who will pay money for this? Who will extend the reach of this research? I think that's your prize. I think it's really important to keep your eye on that, to tap into networks of people who can keep giving you insight, and wherever you can, to build in additional hooks, if you like, which I'll come on to shortly, to your research. So for us, the marketplace is predominantly local authorities and schools, but also universities, because actually knowing the academics who we work with is just as important as knowing the local authorities who will license our research programs. So we've got those 2 elements with us in the middle, and we very much see our role as, it's very simple. I am very simple. It's very triangular. So we've got academics, we've got local authorities, and we've got us trying to join those dots and make the research that we have fit the needs and the budget of the local authorities who are interested in using it, or who have, you know, targets for reducing smoking or improving whatever it may be. So I think that's very important, really, really knowing your market or talking to somebody else who does. I think as well, it's access to things like, you know, even though most of what we do does involve schools, we also talk to GPs about things which might go via a social prescribing route. You know, there are lots of different routes to get your research out there. And I would say be really open to that, because the route you think might be the best doesn't always turn out to be that way. Second thing I wanted to mention was about the pitch. For us, the joy of working with universities and evidence-based research is indeed the evidence base. You know, the people we deal with, it's the evidence base that will ultimately make them adopt your research. You know, that's important. The cost recovery model, again, local authorities, even though sometimes they would love everything to be free, of course they would, they're hard up. But when they might say, well, why does it cost this much per year? What are we getting for the money? It's all those things Paul talked about. You know, it's what's partly the evidence base and all the IP and the money that is invested in the materials and the website and the help desk. It's also things like quality assurance. You know, local authorities love that. They love to know that you are replicating that piece of research. They somehow got a link to the original thing. And I think the pitch is also about the thing I mentioned briefly earlier, all the benefits in a piece of research. So a quick example of that might be, we did some work with a university in London on some successful research around restorative justice in schools to reduce violence and aggression. And they came to us and said, we know that schools really like it. In the trial, we got loads of positive feedback. They're really keen. So we carried out some market analysis, and what we found was actually, as Paul alluded to, they were very keen when it didn't have a cost associated with it, when it was given to them. We also found out from our market analysis that actually, when you talk to schools who hadn't been involved in the trial, restorative justice kind of implied some criminal faction, you know, in the school. and they weren't sure that that was something that they really wanted to publicise, if you like. And also other schools, I mean, we all know schools are bombarded with interventions, and they felt like we've tried these types of things before. But what we could see from the research was a kind of deliriously happy for us side effect was that actually it reduced permanent exclusions. And if you talk to the very same school about would you like to reduce permanent exclusions and improve behaviour, of course they would. Would you consider spending money on that? Probably yes, because the cost of permanent exclusions is massive, and also Ofsted don't like it. So when you're looking at the bigger picture of your research, think about those things that you might, it might not have been your original question, but that could be the thing that gets the foot in the door. And I think we have to think, you know, really laterally about things like that. I think another really important lesson for us is the discussion or the learning we've had over the last 12 years between what's cost effective and what's affordable. So back in the day when there was lots of money floating around, assist was and still is cost effective. However, what we've learned is that doesn't make it affordable. So people will often say to us, no, it's cost effective. The economic evaluation shows it's really cost effective. And it may well be, but is it affordable to your end user? Who has got the money to pay for it, regardless of how cost effective it is? I think keep that in mind when we get involved very early on with researchers looking at building impact, and even into the original funding bid, we're looking at how expensive will this be to roll out if it's successful, and how can you trim the fat because you want to increase the reach. And a final little bit, I don't know how I am for time, Belinda, so feel free to mute me, I won't be offended, is thinking about the sustainability element. When we started, nobody was really that interested in sustainability. So we licensed programs. Yes, the program we've just launched is 4 years, so it's a 4-year license. Assist didn't have a period, it was a 12-week program, but we licensed it for 3 years. Partly that tied in with funding cycles in local authorities. That's good if you link yourself to the funding frequency. But also what we know is people delivering that program get better the more of it they do. It's likely that if someone does it for a year, they won't be as good at delivering it as they will if they've done it for 3 years. So we're also trying to build a sort of asset-based workforce around it. We're trying to do top-up training, support trainers over that 3 years to get really good at what they do. So licensing builds in sustainability. It also, the nuts and bolts of licensing means that people are signing up to, we will replicate this as per the trial. We will deliver it in this way as per the program manual. You know, it's quite a black and white thing. In the same way, we're very accountable. In order for you to do that, we will train you. We will provide up-to-date materials. We will quality assure you so that you know and we know that you're doing a great job. And if you're not, we'll help you to get there. You know, it's a very collaborative thing. And I think the other thing, which again we have talked about, is a good and a bad thing coming last, but is around resources. You know, when you deal in something in public health, legislation, as you know, as an adult, changes, policy changes all the time. You know, who is going to update your website, your materials, your training manual, your quality assurance framework when you're an academic or, you know, you're working, you've got a main job and you've moved on? It's really important if you want people to pay for a program, that the program they get is high quality and they can see what they're getting for their money. So I think those are the ways that we increase reach and we make things sustainable. And also, you could see from Rob and from Andy, the passion that's behind it. You know, what's our why? To reduce inequality, to reduce the uptake of smoking, to lift families out of child poverty. You know, those are massive things and we should nail our colours to the mast and not be afraid to say that. That's what we're trying to achieve. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And there's loads of chat and loads of questions coming in the chat, which is great. And do continue to add them. A sort of a common theme that I've actually heard from all of your talks this morning is about this need for openness and being open-minded and lateral thinking. So with that in mind, kind of like do share your thoughts. There's no such thing as a stupid question, and really looking forward to hearing some of the thoughts in response to these questions. I'm going to kick off with Debbie. Debbie, I know that you had a question.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks to all the speakers. It's really interesting to hear all your experiences and perspectives. I want to pick up on something. It's a really fundamental point that Andy made, and one that we really should keep talking about, and that is the point about what value is underpinning the work that we do, what's driving it. And it reminds me of the rationale around KEF and the income-based metrics, that if you are doing something that's useful, then people will invest in it or they will pay for it. But that's not necessarily that doesn't necessarily follow if you're not working with a dominant or a set of dominant agendas. So my question then is, how do we both appropriately support academics who are working, I'm struggling for another word as against the dominant agenda, so I don't want to say against, but they're not working with dominant agendas. And how do we appropriately support those and recognise that work? And what do we need to recognise about that work? So it's probably a fairly broad question, but.
Thank you, Debbie. Andy, do you want to pick that up first?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Debbie, for the kind words and for the great question. I mean, a starting point might be, and I totally understand it, Debbie, in phrasing your question, you actually said, I don't want to say against. Why not? We live in democracies which tell us in various ways, in all their various flavors, that actually capacities to challenge power are absolutely crucial. And yet when we slip into this kind of discourse, all of us, and you said it, we all feel the pressure that we can't really say that we've got to go with the flow. And so for me, the single biggest part of the answer to your question is, it's okay to be against. I found actually, to my surprise, actually, in the work I mentioned with the nuclear industry, with Unilever and other companies, Shell, actually by being open, that you are actually critical of their agenda, you can find yourself engaged with in ways that are really completely surprising. Because first of all, the world's more complex than you think. Secondly, there are all kinds of diverse agendas inside. Sometimes that, any enemy of my enemy is my friend type of dynamic inside big dominating interests. And because at the human level, people will say one thing in their office and another thing out in the pub. So the world's a complicated place. So let's not be scared of acknowledging openly, and not because power is a bad thing, but because it becomes bad when it's not spoken. So that would be my sort of simple take. And, in a world as it is, it's not noticeably short of private companies. So it's not as if there aren't lots of organizations dedicated to a certain kind of way of working, which is absolutely essential, and I celebrate it. Universities are different. It's not as if markets are in danger of extinction. So universities then should be careful about the value added, about how it doesn't disturb the orientation of their work to start working in these commercialized ways. So I'm not saying it's bad. As I say, I've learned a huge amount from it and been greatly enjoyed it to the limited extent I've done it. But the point is, let's ask much more difficult questions than we often do ask. And then I think it can work really well. But if we're blind to it and think we can't speak about being against, then we're very vulnerable to being inadvertently manipulated.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. I probably guess I really agree with you. It's very reminiscent of my own experience that in challenging practitioners, actually the people I now work with are those people that we originally had a challenge with, and now we work really well and collaboratively together. So yeah, I completely agree with you on that point.
Yep. Thanks.
Great. So I'm going to come to Saskia's question. So Saskia comments the fact that it seems like a difficult decision to take a commercialization or cost recovery route. So Rob and Andy both seem to be very successful at getting grant funding. So Saskia asks, so what is the decisive factor that takes a researcher down this route? Andy, I'll come back to you first, as you're nodding at me, and then Rob, I'll come to you.
Oh dear, I think, why don't we go to Rob actually, because I've just been blathering on, if you don't mind. Rob.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Yeah, it is hard, but I think in the evolution of a research idea, and when it becomes so applied that further research funding is kind of unlikely in that particular domain, then that's when commercialization, when you develop a software tool or an app or something that you think is important, that makes a difference, then you need to find ways of funding that particular innovation. And so we continue to seek research for other ideas and new ideas and so forth. But in order to apply the innovations at scale, it's not really a research funding. Research doesn't have that as its job to apply at scale the innovations that you've developed. So there might be some research questions that we answer, we collect a lot of data and so forth, but I think that it's just on that continuum from very basic to very applied that research funders probably are less interested than commercial funders. And by commercial, it means charging people to use these tools, and that's what makes sense for some elements.
Yeah, well, so if I should chip in, should I, Belinda?
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you're successful in research, then why commercialize? I'm acutely aware of all of my bids that don't succeed, but nonetheless, I guess I've kept myself going over the years. And I mean, one reason to look at, when I say commercialize, I mean the whole range. Charitable, cooperative, benefit corporation, social enterprise, as well as profit, it's a corrective to self-delusion. I mean, academics like me love to talk about how all the progressive impacts that our work may have on the world, but you're easy to delude yourself. And actually, by commercializing and getting people to put their money where their mouth is, it's a pretty good check. I mean, it's not perfect for reasons I banged on about earlier, that there are all sorts of other filters come in, but the best check for any given filter are other filters. So commercialization can be a tonic for self-delusion, triggering a sense of worth among users. If users have to pay for something, they tend to value it more. So if you want them to value key features, for instance, of multi-criteria mapping, getting them to pay for it is strangely, and there are psychologists here who know this better than me, but it's a way for people to then start thinking, oh, I identify with these values because I've committed to it a bit more. And for those like myself, and it's only one form of academic research, not necessarily that important really, but critical research, it's a Trojan horse. A lot of critical researchers who disappear in their own sort of orientation will miss the chance that by actually engaging commercially, that's a very powerful Trojan horse idiom for critical research. So all those things, and then what Rob said at the beginning, also it's a way to raise funds. Which is which is important for keeping research teams going, as long as it doesn't compromise on content.
Fantastic. So I've got a question from Luke, which I'm going to direct to Paul and Sally first. So I'll let you do sign language to work out who's going to answer this one first. So the question is, do you, I guess it's a helicopter view looking across the work that you do. Did you design the product and take it to consumers and adjust, refine, or so I'm bungling this a bit. So did you explore the commercial opportunity? In other words, the size of budget funding available from customers and the market size before defining your product? Or did you design the product and then take it out to those potential customers and just refine? So it's like, which way round do those two things happen? So obviously you work across a number of projects and examples. So I don't know if there's a particular way that this usually happens or a best practice way that this usually happens.
Perhaps I'll just go first, Sally, and then please add to it. I think that the truth is, in the early days, particularly talking about assist, it was the latter, i.e. the sense that there was an output for research. Essentially, it was a product that was going to have to be made available the way it was, and there really wasn't very little we could do to be flexible. It was basically that way or no way. I think more recently, this is probably a benefit for this agenda becoming more widely known and accepted amongst many academics and universities, is that they have what I call impact in mind at the beginning. Now, clearly, we want to have undirected, curiosity-driven research. We definitely see ourselves as being servants of the academics. In no way are we trying to influence what you do in research. But I think it's still a bit different to saying you're allowed to have impact in mind at the beginning. So as Sally says, if you're kind of aware you're trying to get this in, let's say via GPs or via a social prescribing route, you know, don't let the best be the enemy of the good. You know, I think you can still tailor it so you're thinking this has got a reasonable chance of being adopted, rather than something which may be wonderful and gold-plated, but just so expensive that there's very, very little chance of it ever being rolled out. Because ultimately, I think, again, Rob and Andy said this right at the beginning, you know, most academics are motivated to make a difference. And in lots of ways, that difference can be multiplied if the research they maybe did 4 or 5 years ago can then be more widely rolled out. Perhaps if there's time, I mean, I'm also conscious we tend to be talking a lot about sort of senior academics who may well be building their career within the university. I think there's perhaps a different approach that many early career researchers can take, because not all of them, you know, may end up becoming a professor at an institution. I think the universities themselves have a responsibility to think how they can help them develop their careers, which may well be outside of the university. And often we find some of the very best kind of academic stroke entrepreneurs are actually early career researchers who may end up either having a foot in both camps, or in some cases may even decide to take their research, all the learning they've done with it, and actually they're the ones that roll it out in a kind of charitable social enterprise sphere.
Thank you, Paul. I can see our 3 other speakers, and Debbie, I don't know if it depends what view you've got it on, are nodding and smiling a lot along to
Always
that.
a good sign.
And I know that you're running another session, a deep dive workshop on Thursday, which you're going to tell us a bit more about. So I'm sure that's something that you'll explore there. Sally, I'm going to come to you with the same question. I'm going to be naughty because I'm going to build for time. I'm going to attack on another question for you. So if you can possibly think about 2 at the same time, that'd be great. So in your talk, you talked about building additional hooks into your research. And we're just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that. And also, you talked about how licensing builds in sustainability. So if you could, big ask, sorry, there's probably 3 questions in one. If you could possibly expand on that as well, that'd be great.
I had seen, am I on mute? I had seen the one on hooks, so I'd made a note for that, not the other thing. So I think as well, just tagging on to Paul's point, when yes, early days, it was, this is completed research, you know, is there a market for it? Yes, we'll take it on. Now, if we get that finished research, you're balancing what will it cost per head versus what's the appetite for it versus is it a commissioning priority. So sometimes even at the end, it's quite an easy decision to take something forward or not, just because you're aware of the marketplace and who will invest in it. Looking at hooks, for us, there are 2 different types of hooks. So there's the hooks around the example I gave where this intervention reduces permanent exclusions and also happens to reduce violence and aggression, tick, tick. But there are also hooks around our new smoking prevention programme, for example. The lessons we've learned from the original, which cost £42 per student, this costs 85 pence. That's a massive hook. That's the first hook. We don't like to talk about that, but ultimately that is the most important hook after the evidence base. But also it works with the interactive whiteboard. Hey, that's what teachers love using. They're comfortable with that. They can be trained online, tick. Oh, who knew we could link it to the RPHSE curriculum? So we're giving teachers 2 lesson plans that they don't have to do themselves. So building hooks in that make it almost a no-brainer for the end user to take up that piece of research is huge, and it's quite simple to do. It's, you know, these are not big things. The other side of the hook is learning what hooks people want. So where I live, when I spoke to my local commissioner, this is a smoking prevention programme, but it's 4 years, 11 to 15-year-olds. He's really interested. Will that impact on reducing smoking during pregnancy? Because the women who smoke in his local authority are young. And if they've had 4 years of tobacco education, he wants to track that. He wants to baseline that. I didn't know that hook existed until I had a conversation with him, you know? So there's those sorts of hooks. A survey I'm doing at the moment is around, we're putting in a big bid in Scotland looking at multifaceted programmes. So I'm surveying teachers, local authorities to see what risk behaviours would you like to include in a multifaceted intervention, and rank them so that we know if we only get funding to cover X amount, these are the ones people want to cover. And also, which year groups do you think those risk behaviours should be delivered to? You know, so we're trying to gain all this intelligence before we even submit the bid, so that we can craft with the academic that project to try and meet those outcomes, if that makes sense. So that's the hooks thing. Licensing and sustainability. Sustainability for us, because licenses are invariably upfront or annually. So for us, that cash flow, that revenue, we know that that's 4 years of money, if you like, license fees. We also know that if you hook people in for that amount of time, generally they're happy to keep doing it. You know, it's that initial chunk is the hardest sell, and then people will extend for a year, extend for a year, extend for a year. So I think license builds sustainability in that it's revenue, but it also provides comfort to both parties about what they're getting. And they also feel part of something, you know, they feel part of a big network of people all doing the same thing, because we share a lot of data, we have seminars, we do things to connect people.
Fantastic, thank you so much. Thank you for your questions in the chat and comments. There's lots more in there. If we had another hour, we could really dig deep into those, but that's the great thing, because on Thursday this week, we do have a deep dive workshop. Sally or Paul, who wants to, can you just give us a sort of a snapshot of what to expect from that?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think it's a very good title you've picked, deep dive, because I think it will be probably a bit more of a deep dive on some of the topics we've discussed today. I think we want to begin by looking both at the obstacles, but I think also the objections to this. I mean, in one sense, there's been 4 advocates for this agenda. I think it may be useful to maybe look a bit more at some of the objections, because I think actually they're very legitimate in lots of cases, to perhaps try and understand a way forward. We can look a bit at some of the models for doing impact. That could be almost from effectively running a project within a department, still utilising university sort of budgets and HR resources, all the way through to a spin out. Often people think it could be spin out or license. In our experience, often it might be spin out in order to license further down the line. So it doesn't necessarily have to mean a spin out is forever. A spin out could be quite a time limit. It's almost like task and finish thing to get to the point at which it can be unlicensed. Perhaps if there's interest in the room, depending on who's there, we can talk a lot more about early career researchers and I think a slightly different approach they can have. But maybe we'll probably focus the most of the time on some more in-depth case studies. I mean, in one sense, we've given you a snapshot of 2 or 3, but I think perhaps with some slides and some sort of graphics, we can perhaps tell the story of a few more case studies, which hopefully will bring this to life. But actually, just really encouraged by the level of conversations and questions. So actually, we're quite up for making it quite discursive. So rather than just me lecturing down the camera, perhaps we can have even more sort of conversations and questions from you guys.
Fantastic, thank you so much. And I've put into the link a link that takes you to Eventbrite, which is the whole portfolio of all of the conversations and those deep dives. So you can find your way to Thursday's deep dive there, or Charlotte's also going to put in a direct link to that deep dive. So either of those links will take you to a way that you can sign up. So I'm going to ask Charlotte to launch a poll whilst I'm sort of wrapping up and saying thank you. So we'd just love to know your experience of today's conversation. So there's just 2 questions which have hopefully popped up on your screen, and you can just tick one of those to let us know your experience. So the questions are: to what extent did you find this session useful, and to what extent would you recommend joining another conversation to a colleague or someone else in your network? So thank you very much, as I said, and thank you so much, Andy, Rob, Paul and Sally, and we've really enjoyed your contributions today. They've just been absolutely were so insightful from my perspective, and thank you everybody who's contributed in the chat. as we've put in the chat as well, there's a few other ways that you can get involved, as well as signing up for the remaining 3 conversations in the series and the 3 deep dives. You can always also go to the YouTube channel, where you'll find the recording of conversation 1, the recording from this session. I know a couple of people have had to leave early. The recording from this session will be available on there at the end of this week. You can also get involved in the amazing podcast series, The Enterprising Researcher. You can find that on the podcast platform Libsyn, I'm assuming that's how you say it, Libsyn, or go to Spotify. And before we finish, I just want to tee up the next conversation, which is happening on May the 3rd. So same lunchtime, UK lunchtime slot, so 12:30 to 1:40. That's going to be looking at connecting the dots. So this is really focusing on the career aspect, asking the question, how do we combine the elements of a successful research career? So do sign up for that. As I say, that's the next conversation on May the 3rd. So lots of ways to get involved. So yeah, just a final thank you from me to our speakers today and to everybody else who's contributed in the chat. And we really hope you can join us for the next conversation.